Okay, everyone, welcome to class 93, the second half of a discussion on my book, Close Connections, The Bridge Between Spiritual and Physical Reality. It was a rather lengthy book. It also covered an abundance of areas of learning concerning the relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world, though you'll notice I said the bridge between the spiritual and physical. So we're more concerned with how the spirit or metaphysical realm communicates with, relates to, and is the ultimate driving force behind everything that happens in the physical world, including the sending of manifestations, including our communication of our soul with our bodies, and so on. So we got through 5 chapters, really 6, but we're going to begin with the 6th chapter, and we're going to begin with 2 questions that were left hanging. One was something I had mentioned in the class before and forgot to do, which was proving God. How do we prove the existence of God? Because we are that's the beginning point of any sort of meaningful spiritual belief system. And the second had to do with what I got wrong, explaining it more fully, insofar as comparing the translation from which I inferred an incorrect concept of evolution when I wrote this book, which was during the early 2000s. It was published in 2005, but I worked on it for years before then. And then the new translation, which clarifies it both in the translation and in the foreword to that book. In fact, it had misled so many that the House of Justice thought it appropriate to put an authoritative comment on that very problem in the foreword to the new translation. So let us begin with my sharing my screen and starting our discussion on the topic of the bridge between spiritual and physical reality. So we left off with how the Creator creates the evolution as a divine process. But before we get to that, one with the 2 points, proving God, and the revised version of, or the further explanation of, which we got into in the Q&A, but I didn't have before me the passages I needed to respond appropriately to the person who had raised the issue and asked for a deeper explanation. So first, proving God. Now, what am I talking about? I mean, there are basically 2 ways to prove God: an objective proof and a subjective proof. Now, objective proof, of course, from a scientific point of view, means some form of repeatable experience or syllogism or proof that can be represented usually mathematically. Math is supposed to be the cleanest, if you will, or least subjective method by which we prove things. And so you use math in theoretical math to have mathematical equivalencies to logical arguments. My brother has one, and it has not yet been refuted so far as I know. He it is in several of his books. The most recent one is a book called Minimalism, The Bridge Between Classical Philosophy and the Baha'i Revelation. This was printed in 2004. It's still available through Juxta Publishing. And in a mathematical equation, and first he discusses it insofar as making the proof in a narrative which is comprehensible, and it's basically an extension of Abdu'l-Baha's proof to Auguste Forel, and in other works such as well, let me not get into that. Suffice it to say, he extends Abdu'l-Baha's first cause proof, which is an extension of, or a reformation of Aristotelian proof about first cause, that there must be an ultimate first cause, though Aristotle has a possibility of infinite causation, which my brother finds unsatisfying, and anybody else would as well. My brother says there ultimately is a first cause, which is the existence of God, the creator. So he proves that there must be a source, a point, if you will, a primal point, that is God, from which creation derives, but not in time. So in other words, we'll deal with that as well. A subjective proof is the most satisfying in the sense that if you walk into a class and you see my brother's proof on a blackboard and have him explain it, it doesn't give you, it may and has had a very profound effect on scholars and people of science. However, it doesn't give you a sense of intimacy with God or a sense of God as a personal being. So let me read what I've written here about the subjective proof. Though always dependent on rational propositions as proven to the self through independent investigation, the personal proof is the most effective because it derives from establishing a personal, albeit indirect, relationship with God after one has satisfactorily tested the proofs established by Baha'u'llah in the Book of Certitude and other proofs by Abdu'l-Baha and some answered questions and other works. But the ultimate personal proof is obtained through daily communion and personal confirmation of the laws and guidance as experienced and borne out on a daily basis. So as I'm often fond of saying in introductory talks about the Baha'i faith, you know, it's as if there is a being in another room and you can prove the existence of that being all you like, but a person doesn't have a sense of communication or friendship or any relationship with that being unless you have some way of going in that room and communicating with that being. And of course, we can even see that being in personal form in the form of the manifestations. Something we've discussed over and over again, and it never gets old or worn out because it's the ultimate focal point of the Baha'i concept of creation and how creation is brought into being. So let's go into the discussion of evolution and clarify why I got it wrong the first time and what it became clarified to me and how both the new translation and the foreword to some answered questions clarify it for all readers. From the writings, one might infer that man evolves while other life is evolving rather than man evolving from other life. The fact is that in the beginning, there is only primitive forms of life, and over the course of eons, the human being becomes fully developed. Where else could the human being have come from? In short, the latent existence of the human being is there from the beginning, but must await full development before becoming ready for active or conscious or witting participation in its own progress, it being humankind. At what point, we might ask then, does the manifestation intervene? From the beginning, at least from the realm of the spirit, if not all along. So as I said last time, does the manifestation become manifest in some physical form before man is a cognitive being, a fully developed being? And the answer is, I don't know. But we do know that the manifestation is overseeing the process and bringing about the process. As the long obligatory prayer from the Baha'i faith says, it is the manifestation who causes the letters B and E to be joined and knit together. B, the imperative, come into being. That's and of course, the manifestation not only is the source of that creative force, but also designs the process by which that creative force will come about. So where did I go wrong? Well, it's a paragraph. It's just one paragraph. It's on page 193 in the previous translation. So let me read that. And of course, I've highlighted here the part that really detracted from my understanding. For example, let us suppose that man once resembled the animal and that now he has progressed and changed. Supposing this to be true, it is still not a proof of the change of species. No. As before mentioned, it is merely like the change and alteration of the embryo of man until it reaches the degree of reason and perfection. We will state it more clearly. Let us suppose that there was a time when man walked on his hands and feet or had a tail. This change and alteration is like that of the fetus in the womb of the mother. Although it changes in all ways and grows and develops until it reaches the perfect form, from the beginning, it is a special species. We also see in the vegetable kingdom that the original species of the genus does not change and alter, but the form, color, and bulk will change and alter or even progress. Now, if you read that carefully, you see he's not saying that man is a distinctly different species. What he's really saying is that man could have appeared in different forms prior to his emergence in the present form. What Muhammad says in the Quran, the best of molds, by which he means the most beautiful of forms. And as Lucia, my wife, and I were talking yesterday, that isn't it interesting that so much of art, since art begins, is man focusing on his own beauty, sculptures and paintings of the feminine form or the masculine form. We marvel at our own beauty. And sometimes inappropriately, we sort of worship and get distracted by it. Now, here's the more recent translation of the same passage. For example, let us suppose that man once bore a resemblance to the animal, and that he has since evolved and transformed. Accepting this statement does not prove the transformation of species, but could instead be likened to the changes and transformations that the human embryo undergoes before reaching its full development and maturity, as was earlier mentioned. To be more explicit, let us suppose that man once walked on all fours or had a tail. This change and transformation is similar to that of the fetus in the womb of the mother, even though the fetus develops and evolves in every possible way before it reaches its full development. From the beginning, it belongs to a distinct species. And I'm not going to read the rest because it's just a further demonstration of that fact. Now, let us look at the foreword that the House of Justice has included in this work that explains what changes were made in the translation. And basically, it's giving an example of the subtlety of the changes that the translators use. And I say translators, the House of Justice ultimately authorizes the translation after it goes over it. But you have translation teams that work on this together to see if there are any words that could be clearer or better since the last translation was made. So this is from the foreword. A careful review of Abdu'l-Baha's statements in this volume and in other sources suggests that his concern is not with the mechanisms of evolution, but with the philosophical, social, and spiritual implications of the new theory. His use, and I say new theory because it was a new theory. Remember, the concept of evolution occurs with the publication of Origin of the Species in the middle of the 19th century. And so Abdu'l-Baha was talking at the end of the 19th century. So it was a new theory. His use of the term species, for example, evokes the concept of eternal or permanent archetypes, which is not how the term is defined in contemporary biology. He takes into account a reality beyond the material realm. While Abdu'l-Baha acknowledges elsewhere the physical attributes that human beings share in common with the animal, and that are derived from the animal kingdom, in these talks he emphasizes another capacity, a capacity for rational consciousness that distinguishes man from the animal and that is not found in the animal kingdom or in nature itself. This unique capacity, an expression of the human spirit, or in other words, a capacity of the soul, is not a product of the evolutionary process, but exists potentially in creation. As Abdu'l-Baha explains, since man was produced 10 or 100,000 years ago from the same earthly elements, with the same measures and quantities, the same manner of composition and combination, and the same interactions with other beings, it follows that man was exactly the same then as exists now. And if 1,000 million years hence, he goes on to say, the component elements of man are brought together, measured out in the same proportion, combined in the same manner, and subjected to the same interaction with other beings, exactly the same man will come into existence. His essential argument, then, is not directed towards scientific findings, but towards the materialist assertions that are built upon them. Materialist in the sense that the idea that human being is not a distinct species from the animal, but merely a further developed animal. And he is saying, no, that the capacity for thought and so forth is latent from the beginning of man becoming a distinct species. For Baha'is, the science of evolution is accepted, but the conclusion that humanity is merely an accidental branch of the animal kingdom, which is what many scientists, most scientists still adhere to, with all its attendant social implications, is not. So I hope that clarifies it. We can discuss it more in the Q&A if you wish, but this is about as clear an answer as you're going to get. So we come to another chapter which discusses the great chain of being. Now, we mentioned that last time, but I bring it up again because I found a passage that where Abdu'l-Baha uses this same concept. I don't think I had it last time, but maybe I did. This medieval concept is actually a useful metaphor about the degrees of capacity inherent in all created things, from the lowliest mineral to the most highly developed human being. In a sense, the human process of evolution goes through every link in this chain or every rung on this ladder. So it's a useful concept because, this is a slide I did have last time, you see as life emerges on Earth, you can say usefully, as I believe I did last time, that the fruit of this entire process is the human being, but the human being is not independent of these lower links on the chain. Now, according to the medieval concept, you break one link and the whole creation is hurt thereby. And of course, the modern concept of ecology and preserving the various forms of life on Earth is very much attuned to that concept, that in effect, you eliminate one aspect of this chain and you hurt the entire process. So we see, for example, we're talking about the contamination of the ocean and the the endangerment of various species. Well, which one is going to cause the most damage? There's a wonderful story on this I can talk about in the Q&A. I think it's written by Ian Forster, but I'm not sure. But it's a short story, or not a short story, and it's not by Forster. It's an essay, and it's about why the mountains love their wolves. And it's the idea that if you didn't have the wolves to kill off the deer would denude the forest of all their vegetation, and then you would have the rains come and wash all the plant life away, and then there would be no vegetation in the coming season. So also you have this chain of relationship among the various animals and so on. But no doubt we could discuss this at great length. So here's Abdu'l-Baha mentioning this same concept of a chain. For all beings, and this is from Some Answered Questions, for all beings are connected together like a chain, and reciprocal help, assistance, and interaction belongs to the properties of things, are causes of the existence, development, and growth of created beings. It is confirmed through evidences and proofs that every being universally acts upon other beings, either absolutely or through association. So in other words, everything in creation is related to everything else in creation, and that includes us. Again, something as simple as the fact that we need pure water is a good example. Finally, the perfection of each individual being, that is to say, the perfection which you now see in man or apart from him with regard to their atoms, members, or powers, is due to the composition of the elements, to their measure, to their balance, to the mode of their combination, and to mutual influence. When all these are gathered together, then man exists. Now, we come to an entirely different area of science to talk about the relationship between spiritual and physical reality, and that is the concept of quantum physics. Now, we're going to go in two directions. How small does reality get, and how wide does it get? How big does it get? So we've got the nuclear physicist discussing how small things can get and trying to take things apart. And you have the cosmologist trying to see how big things might get. And what's interesting is as you approach in either direction, you approach physical reality. If you're looking at sound waves or electronic waves, or you're looking at physical particles, what is the largest combination they have? What is the smallest combination they have? Each direction you go approaches the nature of spiritual reality. So if you think of it, because each is infinite from the Baha'i point of view, and I'll explain that. So a quark was, just a few decades ago, the smallest, well, not even a few, about 2 decades ago, was considered the smallest particulate that could be discovered. So maybe this was the God particle, they thought. And then a physicist whom I met and who conversed with me about some of my writing split the quark. And now, of course, we have we're progressing very rapidly with nuclear physics and quantum physics and cosmology. So we've got the new James Webb telescope, our new cosmological toy, and we've got the CERN accelerator, which is being revised and restructured and refined as our latest means of dividing reality into bits. Mostly excited about seeing if there really can be something that's faster than the speed of light, which Einstein declared to be, or not declared to be, proved to be the fastest thing, or the fastest speed that could be attained in the physical world. Well, is that true or not? And that's still under debate. So far, it's holding up pretty well. If all material reality is composite, which Abdu'l-Baha says it is, then how can there be a God particle or an indivisible component? So in other words, if everything in physical reality is composed and therefore can decompose, then where do you get to a final particle that is incapable of decomposition or being divided? Because the only reality that is non-composite is spiritual reality and the things that are in spiritual reality, such as the soul and the other spiritual, you have to say entities are essences. Entity implies a thing, so it's not a useful word. Zeno's paradox, you've probably heard of, and it gets at this reality pretty quickly. In a practical sense, it's kind of silly, and yet it's true. Suppose one wishes to walk to the end of a path, but in halfway increments, one will never arrive. And that is if you say, well, I'll go halfway there, and once I get halfway there, I'll go halfway between that point and the next point. And of course, if you keep doing that, you will, of course, you will arrive if you're doing it on feet because you can't measure that correctly. But you know, again, if math is the best representation of reality, there's no end to the point which you can say, okay, I'm 10 feet away, or whatever measurement you want to use. I'm 10 increments away. Now I am 5 increments away, and you keep dividing that number in half. There is no end to the divisions you can go to, in the same way that we don't reach, no one has found an end to the measurement of pi. We're still extrapolating the extension of that. I forget where we're at this point, how many decimals. There is, if you will, in science, an inherent fear of infinity, and it kind of sneaks in subtly in a sort of bias that scientists have against thinking there is a spiritual reality, and into thinking that the cosmos could be infinitely big. The Baha'i writings, of course, time and time again say that the universe is infinitely large. But even though math says, yes, infinity does exist, and you can prove it very simply to yourself by adding 1 to 1 and then keep adding 1, and they'll never reach an endpoint. And of course, the infinity was discovered eons ago, but it was an interesting discovery. The logical conclusion of physical reality being composite is that no final particulate is possible. So then we go in the other direction. How big is that bang? I say humorously or ironically. If there is a singularity from which creation emerged in the hot Big Bang, which is the theory that there was a singularity in existence which suddenly exploded, and from that all the cosmos came into being, and it's been proved by the fact that it was discovered by Hubble that the universe was not in a static condition, that everything is moving away from everything else. Excuse me. And so you have the idea of the universe as we know it today, which is, and the Big Bang is accepted by most cosmologists. But the question then comes is, do you have a Big Bang, but there is no end to this? Or you have a beginning point, but you don't have an end point? Then you have cyclical creations, which Penrose came up with or believes, and has articulated this recently again. And that's the idea that you have a Big Bang, it spreads out, then contracts into a singularity, and then you have another Big Bang. So you have sequential or cyclical creations. Excuse me. Feeney and other cosmologists came up with the idea of multiverses. Now, this is a sort of self-refuting concept, because if the term universe means all that is in existence, then the term is self-contradictory, because if you mean there are many systems like the system in which we see ourselves, or as far out as we can investigate the universe so far, then you would say that the term has no meaning, because if there are other systems as large as this system, that so maybe, in other words, as we get more and more powerful telescopes, then you may find that we're bumping up against another Big Bang that has expanded. And so the edges of our Big Bang reach the edges of that Big Bang, and you say, oh my goodness, another Big Bang was happening all the while ours was. Well, if you believe in infinity, and if you believe that there is no limit to creation, you could say there may be infinite big bangs going on, because you have this problem, you see. If the Big Bang is occurring, where is it occurring? If it was a singularity, where did that singularity exist? It had to exist somewhere, and that whereness has to be a reality, doesn't it? To put it in a more personal point of view, you can say, if I could do a mind experiment, which Einstein was so fond of and successful with, you can say, okay, suppose I am able to travel at the edge of our expanding universe, the very edge of it. And I got my hands by my side, and I'm on special gear and so forth, so I can breathe and go as fast as the speed of what speed the universe is expanding at. And I stick my hand out. Into what am I sticking my hand? Well, you see, this is important because many of the Big Bang theorists, that is, we shouldn't say Big Bang theorists, but those who believe there is one Big Bang that came from a singularity, they say, or many of them say, most of them say, that with the Big Bang, space and time itself or themselves also began. That before the Big Bang, there was no space. Well, it's interesting, but again, if you're at the edge of that expansion, like say you're in a balloon, and it's like many of them compare it to, you've got a balloon and you blow it up and everything is getting further apart, and inside and on the outside of the balloon. But if you could poke your hand through the balloon, or what would be outside the balloon, because there has to be an outside, doesn't there? It's not bumping up against something. Well, hologram is the concept that Hawking most in his final theory of the universe said it is a hologram, which would mean an illusion of some sort created, I suppose, by, well, let me not get into what, but that's his theory. So that's another theory. There are so many unresolved questions that, as I've had discussions with a dear friend and a wonderful cosmologist and physicist, well, he's a cosmologist, Stephen Phelps, who's given many talks on this, on the concept of cosmology and the beginning and so forth. He is a Baha'i. And he says they're just theories upon theories now are emerging. And so there is no final theory at work right now. There are theories bumping up against other theories. So what does the Baha'i answer dictate? Really, it establishes more questions than answers, but if we can take it at face value, the Baha'i answer would be, there is no beginning and there is no end. That since the idea of God was to be known and he brought creation into being, there was no point at which he wanted to be known in time. So that's a chain of causality, but not a sequence that begins in time. So in other words, if God has always existed, God has always had this desire to be known and loved. If he has always had this desire to be known and loved, then he has always brought creation into being. So it can have no beginning point in time, though it has a beginning point in the chain of causality, and it has no end point, because there's not going to be a point where God says, well, that's enough. I'm satisfied that I've got enough people who love me now, so I'm going to stop doing this. So you can see that what you end up with again is the implication of infinity. No beginning or end, no limits to the cosmos or its components. Is that the truth? I don't know. It's the only logical conclusion I have come to, but I may be wrong. No ether. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, this dates back to the Michelson-Morley experiment in the late 19th century, where they tried to decide that well, what they thought they were going to show is what influence the ether had. Now, the ether is a term used by Abdu'l-Baha, and it's sort of borne out in his Tablet of the Universe, from which this particular passage is translated unauthoritative. It hasn't been translated authoritatively yet. It's called the Tablet of the Universe, and it's very interesting, very important, but also very abstruse. But in the course of that, he says there can be no space where there is no matter. In other words, in one sense, then the idea of space stretching out is legit in the sense that there is no, you can cause a vacuum, but that just gets rid of air. But you cannot create anything in which there is not particulates. All created reality is particulate. And so if you have particulates of different size, the Michelson-Morley experiment was trying to demonstrate that if you shone a light beam, that it would be faster if it went with the flow of the ether. And since the Earth is spinning one way in that ether, then presumably going against the ether, the light would be slower than if it were going with the ether, since the ether was supposed to be, if you will, the medium through which light traveled. It would be like if you could throw a rock in a stream and you could throw it against the stream. It wouldn't go as fast or as far as if you threw it with the stream, or a boat or whatever. Boat's the best analogy. Well, it came out that when they went against the ether and with the ether, the light was the same speed, which led to Einstein's theory of relativity, that the light is a constant no matter from where it is viewed. Well, we can go into that in detail, but not right now. So what is the fruit of creation? It's, of course, the genesis of self. The highest form of creation is the human being because it is animated by the soul, an essential reality, restricted to human life alone. However closely lesser forms can mimic human capacity. Now, that's my own writing. That's not from the writings. But you'll find the same idea in the writings. And I had a teacher named Grady Randolph, the best teacher I had in high school, who was the first one to tell me I had a brain. And he used to begin our class in high school by saying, "What have you done today that any well-trained animal couldn't do as well or better?" And of course, he was joking, and in a way, he wasn't. He was, in effect, denouncing implicitly high school education, which he detested. And eventually he got fired, as he knew he would, which is why he also had a law degree. But the local educational television station in Atlanta thought him smart enough to give him his own channel or his own space where he could teach as he wanted to. Self-awareness and free will are the principal powers unique to the human reality, and the conscious and persistent exercise of these powers is it should be the principal objective of our existence. That's not from the writings, that's my own writing again. So the ghost in the machine, as it is called, is talking about this unseen reality that seems to operate the brain, because again, as we said last time, if you put together all of the neurons that are in the brain, and of course the brain is comprised of different lobes and different kinds of neurons, but they're all neurons. So how could you have some autonomous intelligence derived from a whole lot of neurons? And it's the same thing if you had the most complicated computer in the world and it wasn't programmed, it would just sit there buzzing. Interestingly, on the NBC News this evening, Lester Holt was interviewing some people who were talking about, who were in the know on, the one worked for Google and the other had worked for Microsoft, saying that we should be very afraid of artificial intelligence because it's going to get out of control because it's not being overseen, that it could start doing things that we don't want it to do. Well, and so Holt said, well, why can't you just simply unplug them? And he said, because there are too many people, too many companies doing this. But the fact is, there is a ghost in the machine, and you can see that when you see, of course, believe it or not, the most special proofs and important proofs that we have of the fact that there is an intelligence operating this machine outside it, or non-local, as we call it, is due to all of the auto accidents that we have in the world. Because what happens in these accidents when people who survive them with various configurations of brain injury means that you can have one part of the brain hurt, but the rest of it doing okay. So you can have this part of the brain inoperant while the rest is operant, and so on and so forth. They discovered such things as the brain can rewire itself. This is how, for example, when you get aphasia from some aneurysm or from an accident, you can retrain yourself to speak again with the help of someone who's well trained to do that. And various other incapacities, physical, learn to walk again after a stroke, and so on. So in other words, the brain is more malleable and more, we can program it ourselves with others' help. So this is one of the proofs of the soul. There are a bunch of them. The problem of the notion of the brain as an autonomous entity capable of self-awareness, will, and abstract thought derive from the fact that, as I say, logically, it doesn't make sense. But you have many NDEs, near-death experiences, as we said before, that have value under certain circumstances as proof. Now, those circumstances are when a person is clinically dead, and they have to be clinically dead, all the way clinically dead. And they can't do this for more than a few minutes because then you have the no blood to the brain or whatever. Depends on what's causing it, doesn't it? Then you have these out-of-body experiences where people talk about, in effect, going to the next world, or what they perceive as the next world. And they also have these out-of-body experiences where they're able to tell you what's going on in the operating room, and some that tell you what is going on outside that operating room, conversations, actions, and so on. Those are valid proofs of the non-locality of consciousness. That's very important. The greatest encounter with these experiments, not experiments, but these experiences, which can become experiments, are told by oncologists who are dealing with cancer patients who are dying by increments, by degrees, and therefore get ever nearer to death by the minute. And I was reading just yesterday by cardiologists who have people who are going to be clinically dead because their heart will stop and so forth. And many of them, this particular cardiologist was talking about how frequent this is with cardiologists, surgeons particularly. The manifestations, and this is another proof, the fact that the manifestation willingly forgoes earthly pleasure, personal comfort, secular power, or authority. And you say, why? Why does Christ allow himself to be crucified when he has the power to do otherwise? Why does the Bab allow himself to be executed when he proves to everyone watching that he can get away as easily as he wants? So clearly they have the power to do otherwise. The fact that they willingly forego their lives would mean if they had the power to do otherwise, they must know something we don't. And that something must be the fact that the soul and the consciousness continues. To prove them in this sense is to prove the soul, the existence of God, and all they assert. And that is, once you've established that the manifestation has proved to you who he is and what his powers are, and you can only do that by observing the manifestation, which we can do in the Baha'i writings through the detailed history of the life of Baha'u'llah, and commune with him through his prayers and observe his proofs, which he gives in the Igan. So once you've proven to yourself the validity of the manifestation, then you've proven to yourself that you can accept everything he says about reality. But then, of course, you have to interpret what he means and what he says. And so you have the 5 proofs at the end of the Igan of the nature of the manifestation and their reality, and so forth. Some distinctions between the mind and soul. The soul is the essential reality, the essence of our existence. We can't understand it. Baha'u'llah says we can't. We only know what it does. We will understand it more naturally when we when our soul, our consciousness is detached from having to go through what I call a periscopic association with reality. Periscopic in the sense that we are looking at reality and it goes through our brain and then to our soul and then to our consciousness and so on. So you have this indirect relationship or periscopic relationship with reality. Though we are not aware of it because it occurs so simultaneously with our actions and thought. Mind and rational thought are but 2 of the powers of the soul: self-awareness, will or volition, abstract memory or reflection, very important one, meditation, another. Since the soul is metaphysical and non-composite, it will endure, as will all of its powers, though no longer in need of struggling so much to understand the reality mimicked by physical reality. And again, this is my writing, not from the authoritative text. And finally, mind and will. And we've talked about this. What is the distinction between mind and will? Well, will is a power of the mind, but it's sort of separate. So when Abdu'l-Baha says, if you want to accomplish something, first you have knowledge of it or gain knowledge of it, and then you decided you want to implement this course of action. You choose to do it, and then you do it. And as we've said before, and notice what comes first. First you begin with knowledge. So God has created me to know thee and to worship thee. You have this bifurcation of neither is acceptable without the other. I have bear witness, thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. So these 2 actions of knowledge and action are connected with volition, the will to do it. And then, of course, you have this reciprocity between the 2. You go back and forth from knowledge to action. Action gives you more knowledge. Knowledge enables you to give a higher action. And so you have the cycle of the day, which I call the daily miracle, that each day might be likened to all the larger cycles, whether you're talking about a week or a year or a dispensation and so on, that these cycles of life are very important to understand. But Baha'u'llah has, with the body calendar and with his guidance for the individual in the Igan, given us a daily regimen that enables us to progress by degrees by putting our knowledge into action. And so if you take the average day of a Baha'i according to what is suggested or what is an ordinance in some cases, what is an exhortation in others about how you should carry out your day, then you will do very well towards this concept of an infinite progression. And that is, the brain is transceiver for the soul. Right now, where you are, there are countless array of actions and conversations. If you had a We used this analogy last time. If you have a TV set, it will translate those invisible waves into sound and pictures. If you have a CB radio, I don't know if they exist anymore, but you could hear CB conversations over truckers talking to each other. So this bidirectional bridge, which is, of course, the whole idea of this book, enables an associative relationship. The manifestation, the brain, a transceiver, these are all things that enable the unseen to become seen, and the experience, the progress of the soul. So you have this transparency between the reality or the realm of the soul and human activity. This common faculty is what Abdu'l-Baha says joins these two things together, and that is, where does the soul communicate with the brain? Is it attached to it? Well, it can't be. It's not physical. Does it surround it? Well, he does in one case say the spirit surrounds the body. He says, man has likewise a number of spiritual powers: the power of imagination, which forms a mental image of things; thought, which reflects upon the reality of things; comprehension, which understands these realities; memory, which retains whatever man has imagined, thought, and understood. The intermediary between these five outward powers and the inward powers is a common faculty, a sense which mediates between them and which conveys to the inward powers whatever the outward powers have perceived. It is termed the common faculty, as it is shared in common between the outward and inward powers. But he doesn't tell us how that works or what that common faculty is. And I've written the research department at the World Center to ask them, what is the Persian or original term for common faculty? And they said it basically means the common sense, a common sensibility, like common sense that we talk about when we talk about horse sense. So finally, we have this longing to attain this destiny that awaits us. And this is this wonderful passage from Gleanings with which we'll conclude. If any man be told that which hath been ordained for such a soul that has believed in God and followed in according to the dictates of the manifestation, such a soul in the worlds of God, the Lord of the throne on high and of earth below, his whole being will instantly blaze out in its great longing to attain that most exalted, that sanctified and resplendent station. The nature of the soul after death can never be described, nor is it meet and permissible to reveal its whole character to the eyes of men. The prophets and messengers of God have been sent down for the sole purpose of guiding mankind to the straight path of truth. The purpose underlying their revelation hath been to educate all men, that they may at the hour of death ascend in the utmost purity and sanctity, and with absolute detachment, to the throne of the Most High. Thank you very much, friends.